A very warm welcome to this economic policy conference organized by the Economic Council of Finland. My name is Niklas Vanke and I'll be your moderator today. And the omens are good. If you look outside, it's a beautiful day. And when you look around you, this little Finlandia, oh my God, this is absolutely fantastic. The columns, the colonnade outside, all made from entire tree trunks and sustainably built. And what could be more fitting, actually, for this topic we have today? But back to business anyway. Economic policy might sound a bit dull for some, but what is far from dull and very alarming is that we are in an extinction event. And something needs to be done and can be done through economics. Our unsustainable engagement with nature is endangering the prosperity of current and future generations. This is one key headline from the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity, which we shall be hearing more about today. We have the lead author of the report, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, here today as keynote speaker. Following the keynote speech, the Finnish Minister of the Environment and Climate Change, Emma Kari, as well as the Minister of Finance, Annika Saarikko, will comment on Dasgupta's findings. And then there will be open discussion on the review and Professor Dasgupta's insights to cap it all. But first, it gives me great pleasure to invite the Prime Minister of Finland, Sanna Marin, to open this conference.
Thank you so much, Niklas, members of the Economic Council, our distinguished guest speaker, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I have to apologize because I'm leaving to Washington today and my flight schedule was changed, so I have to leave early. I'm not be able to participate to the full seminar, but I'm very happy to be here. I think this is a very important topic that we are focusing today. But first of all, good morning to everyone and welcome to the Economic Policy Conference of the Economic Council. The Economic Council is a body for cooperation and consultation between the government and key economic interest groups in Finland. Most often, the Council tries to look ahead and anticipate future challenges before they hit us with full power. Today we have gathered with a larger than usual lineup to exchange views in one of the topics among our top priorities. How can we make the economy and the environment work together in a manner that will provide welfare for our citizens without risking the ecological capacity of the planet and well-being of future generations? We have already started to understand how this challenge can be addressed in the context of the climate change. The CO2 emissions have to be cut in huge quantities to avoid global disaster. Succeeding requires a change in thinking and behavior across all the sectors of our societies. Moreover, the challenges have to be conducted in a manner that is fair to all groups of citizens. Our government has set an ambitious target of Finland becoming the world's first fossil-free welfare society. However, as Professor Dasgupta's report clearly demonstrates, limiting our efforts solely on the climate will not be enough. Recognizing the need for a broader approach, the government program also identifies the need to halt the decline of biodiversity in Finland and to do our part in the global effort. Concrete measures to restore biodiversity are diverse. In the case of Finland, they include measures such as funding and encouraging nature conservation, ecological compensation, and expanding the national park network. In addition, sea and water protection and circular economy programs are also doing their part. The diversity and complexity of the measures pose a challenge for successful policymaking in this area. Unlike CO2 emissions in the case of climate policy, we do not have a single, well-defined object to direct our efforts in preserving the biodiversity. Introduction of numerical emission goals and setting a price for carbon through taxation or emission trading have been key elements in making the climate policies to work. Could it be possible to harness similar mechanisms in order to make the conservation of biodiversity more tangible as a policy goal? Our keynote speaker, Professor Dasgupta, will touch upon this and many related questions in his lecture that we will soon hear. Professor Dasgupta's review on the links between the economy and the nature, published last year, has gained wide international recognition. I'm very happy that he has taken the time to come and talk with us in person. After Sir Partha Dasgupta's presentation, we will hear reflection from the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Finance, who will dig deeper in the theme from the Finnish perspective. Finally, the floor will be open for questions and comments. Ladies and gentlemen, with these words, I open the conference and look forward for your active participation to the discussion. Thank you so much, and I think Professor Dasgupta, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, ministers, and ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me at the back? Is that okay? All right. Well, it's a great honor. That's pretty obvious, but it's also a great pleasure, and that should also be obvious, to be here in this beautiful country. I've been asked to talk about my review, provide some outline of it, the original motivation, and perhaps give a little bit of a sense of how the human economy is embedded in nature. It's not outside it. To ignore it is a travesty. And I want to, instead of complaining, I want to begin by explaining why it may have seemed reasonable to ignore nature by the older generation of economists, people who taught me, but it's no longer the right way. The review was commissioned by the UK Treasury, your counterpart, Minister. And that was just right and proper because, as I said, the human economy is embedded in nature. And ministries of finance ought to have ecologists, soil scientists employed there, not just economists and statisticians. The review was on the economics of biodiversity, but in fact, I pretty quickly realized that that's not what I was going to write about. Biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems. An ecosystem could be a wetland, it could be a forest patch, could be a coastal fishery, could be a mangrove forest, coral reef, and so forth, grassland. These are productive assets. These are assets, they're durable, but they are also destroyable. And that's, of course, where the rub is. Biodiversity is a characteristic of ecosystems in the same way as absence or presence of trust in a community or a society is a characteristic of that society. It's important because there is a deep sense in which biodiversity, if defined sharply, enhances the productivity of ecosystems. Okay? And I'll talk about the productivity of ecosystems in a minute. So the review really ended up being a study in asset management, which of course brings me right to the heart of economics. And if that sounds odd, do bear in mind that the world's poorest people are hugely successful asset managers until they're destroyed by outside forces. Coastal fisheries, people who graze cattle, they manage their assets, and they have been for centuries, with some thought. There are alternatives. There are competing demands on their lives. Their assets also have multiple goods flowing from it. So if you take too much of one type of good, you eat into something else. So these trade-offs are part of calculation of illiterate people, maybe, but they're never enumerate, by the way. That's one thing you should remember. Okay. So we are all asset managers. We don't like to say that necessarily, but we certainly are. Okay, but not so long ago, and I mean by that 1950 or so, it wasn't unnatural to ignore nature. May I have the first slide? Right. Here you have a time series, 1750 to 2019, of global GDP. And you will, of course, see that from 1900 onwards, it started rising. But about 1950 is where the action starts. And you've seen this kind of figure with regard to carbon emissions, for example. Nowadays, you call it a hockey stick curve. Sharp rise about 1950. May I have the second one, please? Second slide. This one is GDP per capita, global GDP per capita. At this moment, I'm not talking about distribution. The Prime Minister alluded to it, and I will come to it. It's good because there's some uncomfortable truths that arise. Here, too, you will see 1950, approximately, was a watershed. In 1950, global GDP was about 15 times less than what it is today. So it's been an incredible 70-year period. If you look at the next one slide, please, you will see the corresponding curve of the population. And global population in 1950 was about 2.5 billion. Today it's about 7.8 billion. So again, there's been a huge trend. Now these are, in some sense, of course, good things. Goes without saying, people are richer, we live longer, we're better educated. And you can see why then, perhaps in about 1950, when modern growth theory of economics, macroeconomic growth models were developed by such great economists like Robert Solow and others, it seemed at that time Europe was on her knees. Asia was pretty much destroyed, East Asia. And so reconstruction and development were the order of the day. You concentrate on produced capital and human capital, and perhaps ignore natural capital, which they did. So the complaints that I'm going to be making is not about them, but our persistence in ignoring natural capital. It's not so much. So what does Mother Nature give us? Now, I feel embarrassed even asking that, because it should be quite obvious. May I have the next slide, please? There are two, ecologists have identified, for classification purposes, two classes of services. There are others, but we'll ignore that. One you call provisional goods, which are food, water, timber, fibers, pharmaceutical products, and non-living material like oil and natural gas and so forth, okay? And then there are the others, and that's the deep one. Regulating and maintenance services, climate regulation, decomposition of waste, nitrogen fixation, air and water purification, soil regeneration, and pollination. And there are many others, okay? Now, the key thing about the latter is that very often they're silent and they're very often invisible. Think of what's going on under our feet in the soils, for example. The root system of trees, and so forth. So these are two classes, and it's of course clear that the first class which enters into GDP. We're taking goods, material from nature, and converting them into like this wonderful building here, and many other things beside. But it's the latter, the regulating and maintenance services, which are, if you like, the primary products. They're ones which are actually supporting the entire biosphere, everything we do. Okay? And the other thing about nature is, of course, that she is mobile. The wind blows and takes material from one place to another. And that makes property rights rather difficult to husband, maintain, let alone define. And so that's going to be part of the talk. That is to say, what we do here has effect elsewhere. They're carried through the currents. And of course, if they're persistent, they affect the future. And your classic example is carbon emission, of course. And I'd like you to think of the climate change problem as being part of what I'm discussing here, but one part only. Climate regulation is already there. You should think of the atmosphere as a sink, and the seas and the oceans as a sink for our pollutant. So you can measure the pollutant, but in effect you're measuring the inability or the increasing disability of the absorbing sink to perform its duties, performing its functions. Not duties is the wrong word, functions. Okay? So there is a tension between provisioning goods and regulating and maintenance services, and that tension is why you're here. We know there's something wrong about thinking of success in terms of GDP, because that's looking only at the provisioning side. But if enhancing that reduces Mother Nature's ability to supply the regulating and maintenance services, we are in trouble. We've concentrated a great deal on carbon, the carbon problem, which is one part of it. But there are these others. And here's another interesting thing. These others, all of them, these are complementary services. They're not substitutes. They're not independent of each other. So if you destroy one, you're going to be destroying the others as well. It hangs together, not quite like a house of cards, but we can make it into a house of cards because we are so powerful now, we being the human community. All right? So there's a big tension between the provisioning goods and the regulating maintenance services. So when I talk about natural capital, I'll be talking about the latter, because they are missing from these estimates. We're destroying them, the ability through land use change, mining, quarrying, and so forth. So that balance has gone awry, and it's gone awry because the latter are not priced. And they're not priced because of these adverse externalities that I've already alluded to. Okay? Now, how has this played about? I've shown you the first 3 slides, which were altogether good news. And in fact, until very recently, you had a whole sequence of books telling us that we've never had it so good. And there's some deep truth in that. My generation has been about the luckiest that will ever be, at least in the foreseeable future. We all have been very lucky. We have done that by mining natural capital. May I have the next slide, please? And this is taken from a United Nations Environment Programme publication on the valuation of natural capital. And here, these are global estimates, very crude, by the way. The bottom curve is very crude, but it's the best we can get now, and it's an underestimate. It says from 1992 to 2014, produced capital per capita, produced capital means buildings and all that, all the growth and so forth, doubled. Human capital per capita increased by about 15 to 20%. But natural capital per capita, as a stock, declined by 40%. So that brings me back to the point I was just making, that the latter curve is, of course, not available from the national statistics because we don't estimate depreciation. We look at gross figures, gross domestic product, for example, which is the flow. Notice how I moved away from flows to stocks, because I'm talking about per capita capital stocks, which is exactly right, because we are asset managers. What we hand over to our children are assets, one form or the other. It could be financial assets, but it could be material assets, but they are assets. And of course, education and culture, those are assets too. They're embodied in our children. We do the best we can. So we're transferring assets from one generation to another, to the next, in a very seamless, natural way, and yet the economic statistics are not picking that nuance up at all. And one of the things about the review was its advocacy of moving to a system of national accounts, which take stocks seriously. And they are we're not to abandon GDP because it has huge advantages for macroeconomic policy, for example, short-run macroeconomic policies, but as a measure of economic success or failure, we really have to abandon it. That's the wrong measure. I won't go into the mathematical theorem, the ethics underlying wealth, the criterion of wealth. Some of us call it inclusive wealth, to indicate that we are looking at produced capital and human capital and natural capital, and we want to add them up, if you like, to get a sense of what a nation is doing. And if inclusive wealth has increased over time, then distribution aside for the moment, you'll say, yes, we got the balance right. Some assets will decline, some will increase, but you're getting a balance. And of course, these valuation is done not through market prices, but through accounting prices, shadow prices. And there's a huge literature, which I tried to summarize, of ways of trying to tease out the accounting prices of these provisioning and maintenance services, which the market does not recognize. Okay? Having said that, I would argue that we are in, globally at least, we are in such a firefighting situation that even although we should be thinking in terms of wealth aggregated across the various types of assets, we ought to put particular attention, pay particular attention to natural capital. And here's why. May I have the next slide, please? This, I try to not frighten you with a mathematical formula, but on the other hand, you wouldn't expect an economist to not give you something in the form of a notation. Something, otherwise you'd say, well, he's backward. So what I've done is the following. You're asking the following question. What is the demand that we are making of maintenance and regulating services? These are services Mother Nature is providing us annually. Let's say if your unit of time is 1 year, just for the sake of argument. How much are we taking out? How much are we demanding? And we want to compare that with the ability of Mother Nature to supply that on a sustainable basis. Unsustainably she can, because what we do is run her down. It's like a fishery. Think of a fishery as a model. You take more fish out than the rate at which it is generating biomass, then of course the stock declines. If you take less, then the stock recovers. Okay? But left alone, she will regenerate herself. Other things equal, of course. I'm ignoring now shocks and so forth. So think of the biosphere as a self-regenerating resource entity, and that's exactly right. Of course, it's fiendishly complex. The art of good reasoning is to simplify rather than fall into despair because it's too complex. So think of it as a fishery or a forest. Same idea, that can regenerate over the cycle. On the right-hand side, I've got, in the globe, on the right-hand side is the supply. Capital S, within brackets, is the stock, and G is the output. So G is the supply of maintenance and regulating services. On the left-hand side is the demand we are making. How do we measure that demand? Well, the first port of call would be GDP, because that's an expression of our human activities, and it's in our activities which are making demands on nature. So on the top of the left-hand side, capital N times small y, is simply global GDP, but expressed as population multiplied by per capita income. Okay, that's NY. But now GDP is final output. And what on the right-hand side was the services that Mother Nature is offering us. So we need a conversion factor. How efficient are we in transforming Mother Nature's services into the final products, like this building, this conference, and so forth? And that I'm going to call alpha. And that's below the GDP. The higher is alpha, the smaller is the left-hand side, which is another way of saying, say in the case of climate change, moving to clean energy from fossil fuels is one way of raising alpha, because you can get more energy without having to put pressure on the atmosphere as a sink for our pollutant. Okay, so you can see that's very intuitive. Mismanagement, say subsidies that we pay ourselves to eat into nature, to the tune of about $6 to $7 trillion a year. That's OECD estimates. Making nature have a negative price is a way of lowering alpha, making it very, very inefficient, because we are plundering it, because it's too cheap. Nature is so cheap that she has a negative price. Then, of course, much of nature is free, not negative, maybe the oceans or the atmosphere as a sink for pollutants. So that's my inequality. The trouble is the left-hand side exceeds the right-hand side. And you can see the direction by which it has happened in the previous slide. Do we have any quantitative estimates of this? We do. The ratio of the left-hand side to the right-hand side is today approximately 1.6 or 1.7, from which you have the metaphor that we need 1.6 Earths or 1.7 Earths to supply our needs today, which is, you've probably read about in newspapers occasionally. Ecologists claim that we need more than one Earth. Well, I formulated it that way. Now, this can continue for a while, because as you keep on, if the inequality is positive, capital S declines. There's a dynamics here. This is a snapshot, remember. But underlying this is a dynamical system, which changes N, changes Y, and they're all related to each other. Alpha is going to affect tomorrow's Y, and so forth, and so on. And the attention that we give now to nature-based solution to enhance nature, investment in nature, is to improve the right-hand side. Investing in nature is to increase capital S, and that'll mean there'll be more G, making her healthy, a healthier ecosystem, and so forth. So that is the outline, is the setup. And the fact that the ratio is about 1.6 or 1.7, and that's an underestimate, by the way, huge underestimate, because there's just so many of these services which are not measured, that will come up in the measure, says that we are in a firefighting situation globally. And so, although I talk about inclusive wealth, and that should be what national statistics ought to be providing for us, our attention, global attention, should be on the income impact inequality and this huge imbalance we have created. Okay, so now I'm going to apply this a little bit for two problems very quickly, and then I'll conclude with some observations about inequality, since the Prime Minister talked about it, rightly so too. First is our handling of global commons. All my talk today is going to be at the global level, because I don't have the expertise to talk about local, national problems. The oceans, for example, are global public good. Without the oceans, we are all dead, absolutely dead. One of the first questions I asked the director of the National History Museum in London before embarking on my review was, what would happen if life died in the oceans? And then I had a beautiful letter describing the sequence of events. Eventually, of course, it'll be some bacteria which will be alive. They can survive anything, apparently. But we'll all be dead long before that. Okay? So the oceans are overused, they're free. They're a common property resource, open access, beyond the 200-mile EEZ, of course, I'm talking about. And we use it for free. All the trillions of dollars of goods that are transported across the oceans, the fisheries, billions of dollars of fisheries, deep sea fishery, mining, and so forth, and as a dump for our pollutants, that's all for free, which is why, of course, they're in trouble. The oceans are in trouble, and we need to manage that. One possibility, which is suggested in the review, would be to be bold like our predecessors were at the end of the Second World War. They created the United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, and all these agencies, UN agencies. Why? Because they were supplying public goods, global public goods. Maybe currency stability, development, and we don't have quite that courage, because I've had no response to the suggestion that we perhaps need now an institution to manage and monitor and manage, perhaps tax the use of the global commons. You could raise billions and billions of dollars a year. That would be our money, humanity's money, of course, not one. What could we do with it? Well, of course, everybody has his favorite expenditure possibilities, but here's another one. Here's one that we ought to be thinking about, which is the tropical rainforests. They're a global public good. Without them, we'll be dead. Not quite in the same way as the death of the oceans would be, but believe you me, the climate repercussions of it would be quite devastating. They're global public goods, but they're not open access. They are the jurisdiction of nations. So there is truth in a country which houses, as Gabon recently did last week, I think, when I was in Nigeria last week, visiting my daughter, and I think there was a program which announced a minister in Gabon said that if you want us to preserve our rainforests, it would be good if we get paid for it so that we can protect it. We'll have the incentive for doing that. And of course, it makes enormous economic sense. Why should they have to bear the burden of protecting all of us, the rest of us? Likewise, for the rainforest elsewhere, there's a case for thinking about payment for these ecosystem services in the way they're increasingly common within national jurisdictions. Payment for ecosystem services. China is pursuing that. Costa Rica, New Zealand, UK, and I dare say here as well. It's a commonplace idea now that these externalities, external benefits that asset holders enjoy should be paid for. So that's two classes of issues, and that payment could come up from taxes, for example, the oceans. These are details that need to be thought about before embarking on it, but at the moment there's no conversation on this. Finally, I come to the inequality issue, and here is a kind of a tension that I feel we ought to face up to, which is it's not an accident that the world's poorest countries are in the tropics. And it's not an accident, of course, that the world's greatest biodiversity are also in the tropics. These two coincidences are explosive in my judgment, because poorest countries have survived with export of primary products. And primary products, starting from cocoa beans or whatever, you name it. And we import, rich countries import, transform them into marketable products. But the use of the production of the primary products carry with them local externalities, damages. Okay. It's just a smaller version of what I've been talking about all this time. And those externalities are not paid for. So the export price of primary products typically, and in some examples that I've tried to calculate, very large amounts, will be an underestimate of the social cost of the exporting country. So when we encourage poor countries to step up their exports as a way to raise revenue in order to be able to finance development and so forth, which is a very standard argument and a correct argument also in some ways, we are encouraging them to transfer, without meaning to, we are encouraging them to transfer wealth to rich countries because they're selling too cheap. So that's an implication. And with the population growth that Africa is experiencing and will continue to experience for the next 50 years or so, they're far from the fertility transition, the pressure on their local ecosystems will be that much heavier in order to find employment for the youth and so growing numbers of youth and so forth. So these are really difficult issues, but we need to confront them because we do have the tools to think about them in the way that I've just now described. We need to do some calculations of what the tax should be, what export taxes they ought to charge. And they can't do it unilaterally, remember, because then they'll lose out. So they have to do it in combination as groups of countries. So the African Development Bank is a source of that kind of influence, and I've spoken to them about it. Finally, to come to the Prime Minister's point, may I have the next? So I tell you one thing, I sometimes wonder whether I did something wrong in my last life, that I work on a problem which is constantly giving me bad news. So here is from the economics of climate change, you know, well, that the richer you are, the greater your emission. It's sort of a fact. And some time ago, it occurred to me to ask, okay, so it's an increasing function. Emission is an increasing function of income, but what shape does it take? So I had, as I was mentioning to the governor of the bank here, of the central bank, I had the privilege of having in my team a wonderful young man who is from the Bank of England. And when I spoke to him about this, saying that, I'd like to know the shape of it, he went away, of course, as he is a brilliant guy. He took national statistics and plotted the best fit of the scatter diagram of emissions, or ecological footprint here. Remember I talked about 1.6? So instead of emissions, he looked at the national footprint, that same idea, as a function of income on the right-hand side, GDP per capita. And notice that it's, of course, increasing, exactly as you would expect in the carbon emissions rate. Here, the footprint, ecological footprint, does increase with income, but at a diminishing rate. Now, that, as you can see, creates a moral dilemma. Not a big dilemma, because we do believe in equality and so forth, but there's a cost to it, which is that if you do averaging, transfer income from the rich to the poor, then of course, at the margin, the amount of reduction of the rich will be lower than the increase of the poor. That curve shows that, which would mean the total footprint will increase, other things equal, which means that doesn't mean you don't want to go for inequality measures. It simply means we have to do with even less income. That's the trade-off. That is, if you go for equality, unlike income inequality issues, where you say that everything is better if there were greater equality, here there's a cost, that the footprint will be enlarged if other things equal, there was a redistribution in favor of the poor, which means, to me, that we pay that price and reduce our income. So I've now suggested to you that there are ways of thinking about this momentous problem that we have created for ourselves in a quantitatively sophisticated manner, one which could even impress ministers of finance, that they would feel that they should be included in the workings of their daily routine. I don't think our problems, these problems, environmental problems, that's not the way to think about it. We should be thinking about our lives, our future, and they're embedded in nature. And so it's not a business only of the Ministry of Environment. It's all ministries' concerns. There should be now an open exchange over these matters. Every project should be screened for its environmental impact in a way that I've tried to suggest can be done. And I took 600 pages to make the point clearer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dasgupta. We'll be hearing from the Ministers of Environment and Finance, but first the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Emma Kari, please.
Good morning, everyone, honorable attendees, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. First of all, I want to thank you for your inspiring speech, which was definitely a wake-up call for us all. And also, I want to thank you for taking the time to join our meeting. Your groundbreaking report has inspired and invigorated efforts to implement new tools for fighting the loss of biodiversity. Nature loss is happening right in front of our eyes, and it's also happening here in Finland. We are destroying life around us so rapidly that scientists believe a sixth mass extinction is now underway. Yet, overconsumption continues, and the loss of biodiversity accelerates further. Too often, we continue to prioritize short benefits over the big picture and the well-being of our planet. It has become more and more obvious that we need new tools for fighting this development. Your report, Sir Dasgupta, is a remarkable contribution to that. The report has brought the attention of the world on internalizing nature into decision-making. The report provides an important framework for connecting the greatest ecological crisis of our time to their drivers, to the overuse of natural resources. Simply put, there is no life without nature. Nature needs a price tag because our economy, our lives, and our well-being are completely dependent on it. Biodiversity is declining faster than ever before in human history. It poses extreme risks and uncertainties to the economy and to our well-being. The report puts us at the heart of sustainability. We are no longer just looking at valuing individual ecosystem services. We are looking at halting the loss of entire spectrum of nature. Attention has shifted to natural resources as an investment. We have a common responsibility to make sure that future generations will also have an opportunity to enjoy a healthy planet and its natural resources in a sustainable way. The report provides a framework for thinking about the link between economic and biodiversity. Now we need to use this knowledge to provide policy tools to address all the issues related to biodiversity loss. So, what should we do? The answer is simple. We should treat natural capital like any other asset. We have a common climate, but most natural resources are local. That is why I launched a research project in the Ministry of Environment on how to address the findings and the objectives of Sir Dasgupta's report, especially from Finland's point of view. The leader of the project is the Finnish Natural Resource Institute, and a science panel supports the work. Stakeholder workshops will take place in the autumn, and the final report is expected in the beginning of next year. We have known for a long time that economic activities rely on nature and the services and materials it provides. But we have not been able to determine its economic value well enough. Now we should find suitable indicators to be monitored. For example, it is quite obvious that the value of a forest cannot be calculated just as cubic meters of timber. But if the value of forest biodiversity can be calculated in euros, this will help us understand the total output of our forests. Setting up, for example, ecosystem accounting would be a great way to keep track of our natural capital. Ecosystem accounting will give us an opportunity to see how the quantity and quality of our ecosystems and services they provide change over time. I expect that the project launched in Finland will provide tools to consider natural values from an economic point of view. We have to ensure that all legislation, all regulation, and all budget decisions made in Finland in the future will be in line with the ecological framework. So what does recognizing the value of nature mean in practice? We do not always see the value of nature's functions. One everyday example of this is pollinators that are becoming more and more endangered. Food production and our whole life is dependent on the services they produce. Yet the value of pollinators is not discussed in the Finnish Parliament in the autumn when the state budget is approved. Honeybees and bumblebees need suitable habitats to survive. But without understanding their value, we cannot understand the opportunity cost. That is, what is the cost of not preserving and creating habitats such as unmown margins along the roads or leaving decaying trees in our commercial forests? Pollinating insects are a good example of how important it is to mainstream the protection of nature. And we need to act now. Measures to protect biodiversity will be cheaper the faster they're implemented. We need to produce certified nature information to compare the nature footprint of different investments. And also, consumers want and should have the right to get more information about the environmental impacts of products they buy. And all companies should be aware of how their activities affect nature and risks they pose on our ecosystems. On the other hand, companies themselves are nowadays more and more interested in reducing and compensating their businesses' effect on climate and nature. Therefore, we have just now proposed a new voluntary ecological compensation tool in the new Nature Conservation Act in Finland. In the big picture, we must reform our economic system to operate within planetary boundaries. And this requires a collective effort. In a global economy, we cannot reach sustainability by one country or one sector alone. We must integrate nature-positive economic policies consistently throughout our societies in everything we do as human beings. And it is essential that Finland plays a strong role in global cooperation. We must be proactive and active in international organizations. This is necessary also because the biodiversity footprint of Finnish consumption extends far beyond our own borders. Finally, the value of an ecosystem service or natural resource expressed in euros is an important tool. When you look at biodiversity as an asset, the costs can turn into investments. What first looked expensive can now be worthwhile. The green transition is already anticipating huge business potential. However, while pushing forward the green transition, we always have to make sure that it is done in a controlled way. We must stop both crises, climate change and biodiversity loss, at the same time. One cannot be done by compromising the other. As a prosperous, nature-loving country, we should be at the forefront of halting the loss of biodiversity. Otherwise, we have no right to expect action from less prosperous countries. And we need a complete systemic change. And more importantly, we need a change in our mindsets. Nature and economy are crucially intertwined. Appreciation of clean and safe nature is something we Finns share across political parties. We can also be world champions in preventing biodiversity loss as well. Sir Dasgupta's work provides an extraordinary foundation upon we in Finland can build our own solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those interesting insights, Environment Minister Emma Kari. But no fear, there are more interesting insights in store as Finance Minister Annika Saarikko takes the podium.
Professor Sir Dasgupta, members of the Economic Council and other followers of the Economic Policy Conference. Thank you for your very interesting and inspiring and important speech. Promoting biodiversity and combating biodiversity loss are among the key challenges facing humanity. The report, which was published in February 21, under Professor Dasgupta's leadership, it has been a much needed and welcome opening for discussion on the relationship between the economy and nature. And as my colleague Emma said, nature-loving country. That's we are, that's we really are. Nature is very important for Finns, for all of us. We love our forests, we love our lakes. Now it is the early summer, the most beautiful time of the year here in Finland. All the colors, the coming summer. We must take better care of our own nature. And your speech was very important in that path which we are walking. A key driver of biodiversity loss is the ecologically unsustainable economic activity of humankind. One of the main points of the report and in your speech was that we should address the management of natural capital just like the management of other assets, taking into account its value to both the economy and otherwise to humankind. The report can be considered even revolutionary. And the report has also significantly increased discussion on nature and the economy here in Finland too. It is important to assess the impact of biodiversity and climate change on the economy and economic policy instruments in cooperation with international partners and institutions. Nature-loving country, not only here in Finland, nature-loving country in a global way too. And that's why I would like to, in the beginning, say some words about the climate coalition of finance ministers, which Finland is engaged in this work through. The climate action group, which brings together more than 70 countries and 25 international institutions for economic cooperation. And our country, Finland, we currently co-chairs the climate coalition with Indonesia. The task of the climate coalition is to help our member states adapt to and combat climate change based on the Helsinki principles. The goal is also to utilize the climate coalition to assess impacts on biodiversity and increase understanding from an economic policy perspective. The climate coalition supports concrete action in its member states. We seek, among other things, to assess the importance of the circular economy and how finance ministers could promote it. In this field, we Finns could add value based on our experiences. And actually, we are currently considering in the climate coalition how to integrate aspects related to biodiversity and biodiversity loss into our work with the Helsinki principles. A report on nature-related risks and policy recommendations will be published in June. The aim of the report is to enable us as finance ministers to better identify the economic impacts and risks of biodiversity loss and to take them comprehensively into account in planning economic policy. The work of Sir Dasgupta and the UK Treasury has been a basis for our deliberations. Your work is groundbreaking and lays the foundation for progress. Many thanks for that. It should be emphasized that economic policy or increasing economic growth have no intrinsic value in themselves. Economic growth, and particularly sustainable economic growth can, however, facilitate the achievement of primary goals. We can aim, for example, to increase well-being, promote health or safeguard biodiversity. Maintaining a welfare state requires sustainability of public finances. And actually, here in Finland, the idea of our government's program and at the same time our entire welfare society is to build a socially, ecologically and economically sustainable society. The three dimensions of sustainability must form a balanced and compatible entity. A sustainable economy is a prerequisite for the stability of society and thereby also for attention paid by society to the environment. A sustainable society reduces the risk of crisis. And sustainability challenges for public finances mean at least three things in terms of biodiversity. Firstly, sustainable public finances and sustainable economic growth enable the protection of biodiversity with public funds. Secondly, biodiversity loss is a phenomenon of such magnitude that it cannot be resolved by public funds and actions alone. The whole of society must be involved, both civil society and the private sector, which also Minister Kari mentioned. Thirdly, we need to find the means to enable humankind and nature to exist together while simultaneously preventing biodiversity loss. And we have to admit that biodiversity is a more challenging phenomenon than climate change, unfortunately, particularly from the perspective of economic control. To meet the challenge of measurement, the goal is ecosystem accounting that would also take into account natural capital services that do not generate marketable products or services. Utilizing ecosystem accounting in economic decision-making would require monetary indicators. Alongside this development work, it is essential to develop and improve other metrics and indicators that will help us to improve the effectiveness and evaluation of the fight against biodiversity loss. In addition to monitoring the state of nature, it should be possible to use information to select cost-efficient and effective measures, even though evaluation it is challenging. It is just not a matter of using public funds efficiently, but also of achieving as effective measures as possible with public funds. A large and perhaps the most significant proportion of measures affecting biodiversity are local. This is another reason why biodiversity loss it is a more complex phenomenon than climate change. We cannot solve diversity loss solely through regulatory control such as emissions regulations. The local dimension emphasizes the need for bottom-up measures based on local solutions. The local dimension is also highlighted with regard to where decisions are made. For example, in terms of forest policy, I think we Finns, we know best about the state or our forests and believe in Finland that detailed forestry regulations must remain within the competence of individual EU member states. Global markets and chains of operation are expanding local problems into global ones. Local and global, they are quite near of each other. On the one hand, our consumption and investment choices may cause biodiversity loss on the other side of the world. On the other hand, the loss of biodiversity on the other side of the world is also affecting our consumption options and prices due to impaired production opportunities there. Biodiversity and biodiversity loss, as well as the associated risks, have also emerged in the financial markets. Compared to climate risks, however, their definition has proved even more challenging. And the biodiversity loss and climate change together, they are strongly interlinked and cannot be resolved on a separate phenomena. At best, their connection offers the opportunity for synergies with benefits for both biodiversity and climate. This is also an important theme in the current green transition which we are making. Emission-based taxes and emissions trading, among other things, have been used to mitigate climate change, and however, biodiversity is difficult to address with equally straightforward economic control. Therefore, in addition to taxes and fees, the range of instruments must also include legislation and lighter measures, such as advice and voluntary commitments. We need all of them. Various standards, regulations and licensing systems can also include effective instruments. When comparing instruments, attention should be paid to their effectiveness as well as their harmful side effects. There also remains much work to be done to increase our understanding in the Ministry of Finance. And that's also something what I have to admit. The understanding of the phenomena of climate change and biodiversity. Correspondingly, moreover, the Ministry of Environment should have a better understanding in the future of economic realities. Cross-administrative expertise is needed on both sides. Work on identifying and defining risks to biodiversity is only just beginning. Reaching a sustainable growth path requires a change in the structures of the economy and society. Achieving change, it requires not only changes in the private sector, but also by the public sector to support and accelerate this change. And this is an urgent need to combat biodiversity loss and promote biodiversity. We must take this very serious way. It is important to act now. However, few things more forward globally without a financial interest. Understanding the market economy and recognizing countries' economic boundary conditions, it is also the beginning of wisdom in promoting biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Finance Minister Annika Saarikko. Now it's time to begin some open discussion on the Dasgupta review. And one thing that I did notice during the talks given by the ministers was that Professor Dasgupta, you were feverishly taking notes. Would you like to comment on what you've heard from the ministers?
No, not really.
Okay, that's fine with me.
I'm really very touched, obviously, that we're very much in line with one another. And of course, the reason I can't comment is that that would be impertinent. I have really no expertise outside, my scholastic background, as it were. And I concentrated on global problems very particularly because of my absence of knowledge. But what I've heard is so encouraging, you've no idea how thrilled I am from you, Madam, and the Minister of Environment, as well as, of course, the Prime Minister herself. It's fantastic. You're very lucky to be in Finland.
That sounds very good. Thank you very much. So I'll be inviting questions, comments, and if I might encourage you to be as concise and to the point as possible, that would be very good, because we'll have about 45 minutes for this open discussion. I'll be inviting them first from the members of the Economic Council of Finland. And Professor Dasgupta, would you like to take a seat over there?
We do that, provided I don't have to answer.
I think you might have to answer some questions. Let's see how it goes. Okay, and who would like to make the first comments? Well, the Governor of the Bank of Finland, I would say, is quite appropriate.
Thank you, Niklas. You need volunteers always. So warm thanks for your excellent review and for your presentation, Professor Dasgupta. I very much liked especially your intergenerational or overgenerational approach, which is so important for sustainable development and for biodiversity goals. I have a question concerning the role of the financial sector, which is very important in terms of channeling investment to green transition and sustainable development. We have done a lot of work in the network for greening the financial system, for instance, where the Bank of England, for instance, has been one of the leading lights. And in fact, climate goals have become mainstream already in the eyes of the investors. Now, would you have some advice how we should, and I agree with Mr. Saarikko on this, that biodiversity is actually even more challenging than climate goals, if possible. And my question is that what would you advise, how could we help the financial sector internalize the biodiversity goals and turn them into mainstream like we have done already pretty much for the climate goals? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Of course, thank you very much for this question. It's extremely deep and very difficult, but there are ways of thinking about it which I can hint at that could be of use to you. When we do an internal rate of return calculation for an investment project, then I think it'll be better if I stand.
By all means, if you like.
Otherwise, it's sort of disembodied voice from the back. Thank you. When we estimate the internal rate of return of an investment project, which is a standard route, the internal rate of return is a sort of a shorthand for essentially asking ourselves, what is the present value of the flow of net benefits or profits, depending on who the agent is. But if it's a government agency, you should be talking about net benefits, expressed in dollars maybe, or euros, as the case might be. And then you use a discount rate, we call it the social discount rate if it's a public agency. And there's a standard formula for doing that. And when you do that calculation, what is it that you're actually performing? You're asking yourself, and I can give you the answer. The answer is that the present value is you're summing up, having used the discount rate, the flows. The sum of the flows, however, the addition of flows is a stock. That's what it is. So when you do this present value calculation, you're asking, does the project contribute to wealth? That's what it does. So in fact, we have been using the wealth index without knowing that we were using the wealth index when it came to decision making. But of course, sustainability analysis asks us, are we better off now than we were before, in some sense? And there, again, the wealth index comes in. I've been harping on the latter, but as the governor is asking, that's what we are doing actually the same with regard to projects. Now, the problem with the usual cost-benefit analysis without the environmental component is that it's missing out on these inputs and outputs, particularly the outputs, since you're asking, what about a project which is investing in nature? Now, investing in nature is a subtle thing because it doesn't require bulldozers necessarily. It, in fact, tells you to have some fences keeping people out so that the ecosystem can recover. That means waiting. And that's where, not with the quality of a finance minister that you have in your country today, but I used to have problems with finance ministers in India 10, 15 years ago. I like to think they've changed, by the way. Which is, they'll say, Partha, it's all very well for you, but where's the bottom line? We have to worry about the bottom line. And where's the payoff for waiting? Well, the point is, of course, you would be using accounting prices. You wouldn't be using market prices, because if you did, you would be back to square one. That's the whole point. So we better start estimating the shadow prices of these natural assets. Not so much biodiversity, but the productivity of use the productivity of the assets as a way of estimating the value. And there are plenty of ways of doing that. They're difficult, they're imperfect, God knows what else, but of course, bear in mind that estimating GDP is also very difficult. It's just that we keep on we're so used to it that we believe that the numbers that come to us are sort of somewhat platonic numbers. They're not. A huge amount of approximation goes in and doing cost-benefit analysis. Now, the one point I would like to make, it may be of help to us all here, is that because we've been trashing nature so that natural capital has been declining, whereas produced capital and human capital have been increasing, the accounting price of natural capital, I'm using now a broad brush word called natural capital, but the accounting price of that, relative to produced capital, will be increasing over time, because one is declining and the other is accumulating. So under business as usual, so to speak, it'll be increasing. And that's a great advantage, because your cost-benefit analyst will be saying that instead of assuming that the prices are pretty much constant over time, which is the usual practice in cost-benefit analysis, but that's for purely ease of reference. You have a flow of, say, for 30, 40 years, a flow of net benefits, and you assume it's pretty much constant, and then you add them up, having discounted them, and you compare it with the cost, the investment outlay. But there's no reason for these relative prices to remain constant. And here, of course, there's a very good reason they're not. The natural capital price will be increasing. Now, think about it. If the net benefit of the project, which is nature investment in nature, goes up relative to the unit of account, which is produced capital, income, if you like, then the effective discount rate you're using will be lower for this project. In fact, if the price is going up sufficiently fast, your discount rate will be negative, which means that the benefits from the planting of that tree, which comes about 40, 50 years from now, will actually not be shrunk by discounting, but enhanced, because you've got a negative discount rate. So, as you can see, pure common sense and elementary economics takes us a long way to trying to incorporate these ideas into tractable things. And if the surprise was that, no, do not do any investment in nature, then I would think there was something wrong with the reasoning. And here I've shown you that actually the correct reasoning is driving us towards greater investment in Mother Nature, which is exactly what the macroeconomic stories were telling us. I don't know if that helps, but that's how I would go about it.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Professor. I'm the CEO of Finland Chamber of Commerce, and it's suitable that the governor of the bank asked about the role of the financial sector. I will ask about the companies and the pricing mechanisms. First of all, I noted that you referred to the property rights, and I blame John Locke here, the Scottish philosopher from the 1700s, when he defined the property rights as someone mixes his or her work with the natural resources, then you create a property right. And of course the problem here is that he assumed that the natural resources are infinite, and that's clearly not the case. And so therefore we must be able to tackle the externalities. There are three kinds of ways of tackling them, of course, from the different approaches: conserving nature, capping the consumption, and of course the pricing the externalities. And I think that the climate policies is a good example and start for the management of the natural resources in global level, because we have fought some of the battles already, but it's still the mix of policies here. Unless you count that in Glasgow we finally reached the agreement in principle of capping the emissions when the big economies like China were giving their target year for the carbon neutrality. And it's easier for the emissions because you can put a price for an emissions. It has roughly the same impact globally, but it's far more difficult for the ecosystems when they are more global. But if we start with the more global ecosystems, after atmosphere, as you pointed rightly out, there are oceans and rainforests. And as you proposed also in your paper, that the pricing the polluting or using the fisheries in the oceans could be a good basis for the global tax or price that we can collect and use them to invest in, for example, the rainforests would be a no-brainer from the economist perspective. But now that we have seen how difficult the climate policies are, and now that you have been going around in the world in different countries, how do you see and how can you see this kind of a global understanding emerging that we could have this kind of a global governance on the oceans and rainforests?
Thank you very much. This is a very difficult question. Again, like the governors, I can just cut into it with some thoughts, but not very much more. I think the issues that you're raising have to do with pricing versus quotas versus regulation versus taxes, and that's absolutely right. These are instrumental instruments that we use. And when I talked about pricing, I should have been a bit more careful. I should have said that, of course, we are talking, in some cases, you would want to have quantity restrictions for a very good reason. So there are good reasons as to why we might want to use regulatory devices, as it were, as opposed to taxation. It has to do with imperfect information. The fact that I do not know your profit function, you don't know my utility function, and so forth. And if you're near a precipice, one thing you don't want to do is to use a price to deter jumping over the precipice. You just put a barrier and say, no, you can't come here. That's what we tend to do with children, remember, when it comes to. So we don't sort of bribe them into not doing something. We actually prohibit them from doing that. So for the global commons, yes, it is true, I did talk about pricing. And I think we should be thinking about doing that, for example, for fisheries. Global fisheries, I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to do, because there are many fishermen, and then you can choke off the total aggregate demand through a pricing system. But for large terrains where, for example, fish migrate or the great whales migrate and so forth, there you probably require protected zones, and those are like quantities. But even within quantities, do bear in mind that in climate science, climate change, we have quantity regulations, and the idea is to have tradable permits. So there you have a sort of a mixed regulation pricing structure where you cut off at the aggregate level through quantity, but how that aggregate level gets distributed across firms is dependent on the pricing system. So you sort of say that you have permits, pollution permits or something. And effectively, that can be done in other cases as well. I can't be very precise, obviously, but the idea that you do the whole of the oceans through regulation, I think is really unmanageable. But one reason is that you can have protected zones, but living matter travels. So you can create a protected zone, but they're not going to be responding to that. And so at some stage, we need deterrence at the source. So that's why I was concentrating on pricing. And of course, in the case of the rainforests, it's almost trivially true you have to use a pricing system in the sense of compensating countries which house them, because you can't simply say you can't do it. They're going to do it. It's their national sovereignty. You may not like it, but they are doing it. And the only way to do it is, I won't say it's bribing, because it's not really bribing, just for our own benefit. So we're paying for the privilege of enjoying those services that we can't. So at the end of the day, we are really looking at problems of pricing, putting evaluation, and then having an institutional mechanism for that valuation to be the tool with which the individual actors respond. So the classic problem in economics remains, which is how do you get incentives so structured that individual incentives are in line with the common good? That's the problem of economics. If somebody says, what is economics? That is it. That's how do you do that. The rest is just details in volumes of them.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from the Economic Council of Finland? Over there, yes. Bring you the mic.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm representing the asset managers, Finnish forest owners and farmers. My name is Juha Marttila. As mentioned many times, that this is a key question to how to combine private incentives and global interest. And in our case, I see that the question, actually what we are trying to do and develop and also demanding is functioning market mechanism for ecosystem services. But actually my question goes to global food security and especially the role of small-scale family farms. There are almost 2 billion people working in agriculture, producing food for local communities. Almost 2 billion people. And their role will be really decisive in the future, not only in food security, but in climate questions and especially in biodiversity. This is a really big question, but we know the problems. Access to capital, access to new technology, finding new solutions in, sustainable intensification. How to use current existing production land area and or resources in a sustainable and efficient way. We know that in climate funding, only 1.5% of climate funding goes to small-scale family farms, almost 2 billion people. And how to avoid these questions this problem in biodiversity? I'm very worried about this. How do you see the role, these questions and the role of small-scale family farmers in the sustainable questions? Thank you.
Oh gosh, these are impossibly difficult questions, particularly then it covers so much ground, so many types of resources. So I can work through some examples to give you a sense of how at least I've thought about it. You're quite right for pointing to the world's poorer people. Okay, if you're looking at these small-scale farmers, particularly in Asia, Africa, Latin America, we are looking at really very poor people. Now, it's very hard for me to generalize from that. Of course, the idea of being, there's a public good called knowledge, and then obviously there's a paucity of knowledge of new methods of farming, and new techniques, technologies, then access to seeds, for example. So those are more standard problems. Okay, I mean, I have no particular expertise. Agronomists have discussed it, the financing of such investment. I have nothing really to say. What I can say is about something more, I think, in a sense, closer home to the kinds of problems that we are discussing here today, which is there's been a good deal of very interesting studies which are sort of natural experiments so that we can believe the econometric work that comes out of it. It's not just running regressions. There's some natural experiments to show that local communities manage the forests better than the state. Now, at one level, once you get that information, you would say, well, of course, it must be true, because after all, when the state manages it, it's somebody from outside who comes along and says what you can do and what you can't do. And what you can do and what you can't do is something that can only be understood by somebody who understands the ecology of the local system, and who are better than the people who actually live there. So in that kind of a world, I would say lay off. I would say the state ought to withdraw. There's a lot of work in Nepal, for example, a good deal of work on forestry management in Nepal, which is a dirt poor country maybe, but they were pretty smart about allowing communities to manage their forests, especially when they found that the forests were actually declining. So these studies that I just now mentioned are actually the natural experiments there, where what the state claimed ownership over versus the communities was not determined by biodiversity issues. It was some political decision that was made depending on how far it was from the state capital and so forth. Okay, so that's why it was a natural experiment. Then you look at, say, canopy cover, and you find that it's richer, denser, as a surrogate for biodiversity in those which were located. So in that kind of a world, I would say, in many cases, you lay off because you allow the information that is actually local to thrive, because the outside knowledge is, in fact, a deterrent to good management. That's very similar to fisheries. Lots of cases of that. So in a way, that would be a blanket kind of an argument that local ecology is better understood by local people, and therefore, in some sense, even if the state wants to enter into it for a variety of reasons, for redistribution purposes and so forth, it ought to employ, if you like, the local people as the advisors, as opposed to somebody who comes in from the state capital to do that. The second kind of problem, which I actually had cause to discuss at the interview I gave before, to journalists before coming here this morning, has to do with the very deep point that's raised in your question, and that relates also to the governor's question, which is risk and the correlation of risks. So when thinking about the world's poorest countries, we think of them as primary producers, and I discussed that right at the end of the lecture when talking about Africa's plight of having to rely on primary export of primary products for development purposes, and then losing a certain amount of wealth in doing so because it's not being able to capture the social cost, the cost associated with it. Now, the thing is, these ecosystems are these small farmers, small agents, managers of local ecosystems. You're using the word farm, but let's expand it a bit to include grazers and fishermen and people who live not so much farming, but gathering for marketable purposes and so forth. And these risks are correlated because ecosystems are related to one another. If this gets damaged, the adjacent ecosystem gets hurt as well. Which means that for the importing country, say the company which is importing primary products, and it's the source of the supply chain, the earliest bit of the supply chain is out there, the risks that potentially competing importers face are correlated. Because if I mismanage my source by not paying enough attention to it, or maybe I'm a manager with a high discount rate because I'm going to be retiring soon, what the hell, I want to jack up the profitability, then I'll be pouncing on, I'll be asking for deeper production, that kind of incentive. That's a standard thing that we study very often in the business literature. These are correlated, but correlation means that insurance is not going to be a very effective way of handling the problem. Moreover, there's moral hazard involved. So one solution to the moral hazard problem that I suggested, at least in the review, was that disclosure may be a way of avoiding the moral hazard. That is, just as we insist on firms which produce food products that we buy in the supermarket are obliged today to disclose the food content because we insist on that. We won't buy unless you tell me because I don't know whether I'm being poisoned or so forth. Okay, so why? So that's it's demand-directed, consumer-directed disclosure, which is actually, they have to comply with it now. Of course, it's law. But here I'm suggesting that maybe disclosure of the entire supply chain, what's happening to the products that I'm importing And what am I doing in the process? You know, how much of, you know, what kind of traffic I'm using in order to import the stuff, and then the manufacturing and so forth. At the manufacturing end, you have data because it's in the rich country, and the consumer might want to check that the effluents comply with the amount of effluent, it complies with the regulations. But out there, that's absolutely cowboy country, okay? In the sense that who is checking there? You are not. And so maybe their idea should be for us to insist that firms disclose their entire supply chain, the conditions of the supply chain. Now, of course, an individual firm, I happen to have on my advisory panel a very distinguished financier. And he introduced himself to me when I first met him as ethical finance. And he was a great man, Sir Roger Gifford, who unfortunately very sadly died end of last year. And he said, of course, there is money to be made by being ethical because consumers demand it. If you have a first mover advantage, I go and disclose that I'm actually selling you a product which is not ecologically damaging way up there in the early part of the supply chain, then companies are going to come to me. I'm going to build up reputation. But on the other hand, it may work for some companies in some situations, but there is risk involved in it. On your own, you're doing it, and you're investing in that, but your short-term profit suffers relative to others, and you worry about your market share. So the solution to that would be, because of this correlation in the risks, for companies to agree that they should get the government to insist that they do disclose. So it's a collective tying of one's hand, which increases their profits, long-term profits, because they are protecting the thing. So there are several ways of thinking about the question you've just asked. I'm not completely sure I could answer for an agricultural producer, but in a way I don't feel too embarrassed because the agricultural producer is, of course, producing a provisioning good. My lecture was about the maintenance and regulating services. So I think I'm on safe ground in avoiding your real question. Thanks.
Good. And any more impossibly difficult questions for Professor Dasgupta from members of the Council? No, that means I'll open it to the whole audience. Do you have any questions for Professor Dasgupta? Okay, the man over there. Yes, your microphone's coming.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Teppo Säkkinen. I come from the Finnish Chamber of Commerce. Now, the ministers mentioned compared biodiversity loss with climate action and mentioned that it is a more complex issue, a more local issue. With regards to climate, we are increasingly not just talking about carbon footprint, but also carbon handprint, which is the positive climate impact that products and services can have, that you create services and products that can decrease emissions of others, which is also the implication that the green transition is a huge business opportunity, that is a driver of investments. And of course, this market and demand has been partially created by carbon pricing and regulation. When moving on to combating biodiversity loss, we have companies that are exploring how to measure their biodiversity footprint. But do you think that this approach of identifying the biodiversity handprint, the positive impact, is a useful concept in this discussion? Can we find business models and business cases where having a positive impact on biodiversity can be also an opportunity for companies and entrepreneurs and landowners? And have you come across to these kind of models in your research?
Oh, yeah, absolutely right. You're quite right. The answer is yes, absolutely. And I was trying to allude to that in my previous answer, because you're essentially trying to buy yourself some reputation. But that reputation can only be purchased if consumers demand that. At the end of the day, the problems that the finance minister addressed, and the prime minister did, and the minister for environment did as well, these are problems for we citizens. They're not really government problems. Governments will do, in a democratic society, and you happen to be fortunate enough to live in, as I do, they'll do what they're told by us, gently, of course, and nicely, of course. But that's the idea. But the ultimate responsibility for the human economy falls on each of us. And my review was very explicit in my preface. I said that I'm addressing the citizen, the concerned citizen. I had in mind the person who, very much in mind, it's not an afterthought. All writers, every time we put our pen to paper, we have in mind the person we are addressing, some mythical person maybe, but it is somebody who is reading what you're writing. And the one I had in mind was, and I can be, it's very embarrassing, I had in mind an elderly lady. Somebody like my mother, actually, who used to express concerns about these, but she didn't have a language to do it. And I was writing this for that person, that if she raised the matter, an economist would immediately translate saying, well, there's no bottom line, this is not profitable, or this is not that. And I knew that was a bad answer, so the right way to do it is actually to give the grammar of an argument for her. So I think at the end of the day, it is us who can discipline companies. And the one advantage, and there's one reason we should be quite optimistic about it, and we can be, is that after all, company managers are also parents. Sometimes they're grandparents. And if they have difficulty at home, what are you doing in your business hours for nature? That can be a big disciplinary action. So I think many agents are involved here, but particularly we citizens. And I think we shouldn't forget that. We tend to think that it's the government's obligation to do everything that we don't like to think about, but these are problems at every stage. And I think the right thing to do is to think of it not as a very difficult problem, but to ask yourself, how can I simplify it? How can I think of it as an asset management problem such that where are the incentives? Who has the incentives? How do we get the incentives right? And usually there is an answer to it. Approximate maybe, but better than not having an answer at all. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I see the economics of nature.
And the next question goes to, I think it's the second last row over there. Just a second and we'll get you the microphone.
Thank you. Irina Herzon. Professor Sir, like yourself, I work in a university, so my life task is to pass the torch of knowledge, but also inspiration to a new generation. And I increasingly see young people being really troubled with the state of the world and inadequacy of institutions in responding to those. They come to the world of bad news, as you mentioned. So from your long professional and life experience, how would you advise these people to retain hope and motivation to be engaged in with finding solution to the crisis in which we landed them? Thank you.
Indeed, I think about that a lot, and I can't do better than the following, which is to say that first of all, we can't solve the world's problems individually. That's not possible. So that's not the question to ask ourselves. Our first question would be, some of us are in the privileged position of being, say, retired as I am now. So I have time. I don't have to get a job. Okay, so I can't speak with, I can't be moralizing about it. That would be wrong. But if all of us can do marginal things and hoping to influence our neighbors, friends, and so forth. So it seems to me a lot of this should be done at the local level. If you can get your neighborhood to be cleaner, nicer, or as the case is now, rejuvenating nature in urban areas, which is a big thing now in southern England anyway, and no doubt in this country you are far ahead of us, probably in the United States, in England. I think one should be quite satisfied with doing that. Of course, if you have to march in front of the Prime Minister's office to get some action done over there, that's good too. We used to, my generation used to do it over Vietnam. A lot of marching, okay, but we couldn't stop the war. That's absurd. How do I do that? We can't do that. What we can do is to just make our presence felt, get rid of some anxieties and so forth. But broadly speaking, I think it's local initiatives that really, that's how I would encourage it. Otherwise, to get on with their life, and if they want to do something else, that's right. What fits them. I would not think there should be despair, because there's nothing very much they can do. Despair is not a very productive state of mind, particularly since you can't do anything about it. Because, but what you can do is to contribute to your neighborhood, so to speak, and influence your colleagues, friends, to speak up on the matter. Write to newspapers, make some friends amongst journalists, and so forth. So many other ways we can be active. But I think these are all productive ways of doing it, and I can't do anything better than that. I mean, we all are very, very limited. We are nothing. Each of us is nothing. 7.8 billion, remember, so, in all of us. So.
And the next question goes to the gentleman here in the second row.
Thank you, Sir Partha. My name is Janne Kotiaho. I'm professor of ecology and the chair of the Finnish Nature Panel. So, if I understood correctly, the biggest problem that we have to solve is kind of these adverse externalities, like you mentioned. And then we heard in the discussion that we actually seem to have all the tools necessary to do that. So, Sir Partha, why are we failing? That's my question.
Well, one reason is that the population over which our activities have an imprint is not confined to your neighborhood. And scaling up cooperation from the village community or the small neighborhood community in Helsinki, for example, to the national stage is hard enough. To the international stage, it's really, in some cases, impossible, as I was suggesting in my lecture, over the oceans and so forth. So yes, conceptually we understand it, but the effects spread over time across great distances. And cooperation across people, across groups who are far off from one another, is really very hard with competing. I mean, we're just now seeing what's happening in Ukraine. So where's the cooperation there? We have, so I think that's at the heart of it. And I think it's each Minister of Finance can do just that much, no more, because his or her jurisdiction ends at the borders of the state. Then you can have negotiation with your counterparts, but that's about as best as you can do. So I think this problem is going to be there with us, because we don't really know how to scale up. In some urgent things, we have been very successful. It's just we forget how successful we have been over such global public goods as airspace, keeping time, for example, or the airwaves. Those are global public goods, so the space that we're using are global public goods, and there seems to have been very good cooperation over those. We seem to fall apart on the remainder. So I don't think there's an answer to your question. It's really a question of whether the finance minister here, you, madam, can find equal enthusiasm with your counterpart in UK over any problems that arise, externalities between Finland and the United Kingdom. And that's a tough one.
And the next one goes to the middle of the third row over there.
Thank you, Sir Partha. I'm Hannu Savolainen, economist at Finnish Environment Institute. And this question might be a little bit technical one, but I think it goes in the heart of the problem here. I want to distinguish first concepts price, cost, and value. And I would like to revisit the discounting you mentioned earlier in your answer to Olli Rehn. How should we and how could we set the discount rate or the discount factor right, and who should do that? Because I think that we can't leave that question to economists, let alone invest project calculators, so to speak. Thank you.
Well, yeah. So there are two aspects to your question, but the first aspect is the one I thought you were heading towards, but then you went towards discount rate. So I'll start with the one which I thought you were going to, which is that in some deep sense, I think there's been an implicit understanding that what I was doing was to concentrate on the instrumental worth of nature's services. What is it done for us? It's an anthropocentric viewpoint. Now, anybody half with any sense of proportion or decency would know that that is an underestimate. Many communities regard the natural environment as sacred, or at least where I was raised, certain plants were sacred. Absolutely. They had some medicinal value, by the way. So don't forget, there is a correlation between sacredness and usefulness. But never mind, that's it. So that there's an undercount here. Nevertheless, I did that. I have a chapter, by the way, in which I ask the question about the moral worth, moral value of organisms, life forms which are not human, remotely human. And there are some interesting things that can be said about that. The reason I avoided that is I wanted to take a minimalist cut onto the problem. Now, if I know that I've got it wrong, in the sense that my answers are biased because I've undervalued nature, and then I show that actually even then we're in really deep trouble and we have to put all our money on it at the moment. Or when I say all money, it's like a firefighting situation, as I was trying to argue. Then of course it'll be even more if you put in the additional values. So I was on safe ground. If I showed that on instrumental grounds it doesn't matter, then you could come along, somebody could come and say, well, look, this is the economist at its worst because you're only looking at nature as an instrument of human enjoyment and so forth. And if we're all dead, nature is still there, it has a value. So that's the answer. Now, regarding the discount rate, I think the answer I'll suggest to you, and it's not something we can sort out in this forum, we haven't time. It will be unconventional, but I have given a lot of thought to it, so I'm speaking with some confidence. I'm not throwing off an odd remark. It is not a pure technical variable. It involves judgment between today and tomorrow, between myself, my children. But more important, not so much between myself and my children, but myself and your children. That's the difficult one. And it has been a tradition since you asked the technical question in economics, one of the worst things that's happened in our profession about the 80s and 90s in macroeconomic thinking was to imagine that the economy is a household. So let's say the US economy is a single dynasty. And what we do is to ask ourselves, look at data regarding savings rate, consumption rates, and so forth from the national statistics, and see what valuation we can give to this mythical dynasty, which will replicate whose answer to the question, how much should I save for my children, and then my children save for the grandchildren, and so forth, will replicate the statistic. Okay? Now, so the US economy is a gigantic household. That's the story. And of course, the household recognizes that there will be children and grandchildren and so forth. And that has really driven a huge amount of macroeconomic thinking, and including choice of discount rate, as you know. Now, what's wrong with it? It's wrong not because we don't care about our children, we all do. But with these externalities, it's important that I care about your children and you care about my children. Otherwise, you and I could be going in a prisoner's dilemma game. All right. So for that, you need some kind of a moral judgment. And that's going to differ from people to people. So I think it's a political variable. And I think the only way to handle it is to do sensitivity analysis, take ranges of values, and then see what they tell you about how much investment and what to invest in, say, the governor's question. It will influence how much we put in to revive nature, how much we put in to give aid to poorer countries and so forth. These are related questions, interrelated questions, as we can understand. And I don't think there is something called the social rate of discount. That's a mistake. It will differ from person to person, given not just ethics, but a perception of what lies ahead. And that will differ from person to person again. So I think sensitivity analysis is the best we can do. And that best is good, because it reflects correctly the fact that it's not like asking, what's the price of fish in the market today of a particular type today. You've got to get a hard answer to that. Somebody phones you up and says, well, today it's so many euros per kilo. It's not like that. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's...
I think I'll take a risk time-wise now and ask for one more question. The gentleman here on the aisle side, third row. If I could ask you to be short, sweet, and of course impossibly difficult, then that's very good.
I'll give it a shot. Many thanks, Professor, for these excellent remarks. I work at Sitra, at the Finnish Innovation Fund, as a climate and nature specialist. I wanted to ask, how should we start analyzing the potential tipping points, which we haven't discussed at length today yet, and how should we get the incentives right for those?
Wow.
Thank you.
Okay, the idea about tipping points is an extremely important one, because of course we are now becoming more and more aware of them. But actually you've seen tipping points in your garden. We all have. If we have a garden and we have a garden pond, a little pond, then in the summer months, in the morning, because the nighttime was reasonably cold, you come out and see this clear water and everything, and midday heat, and then suddenly it becomes murky. It's got algae in it. Or it accumulates algae and then it flips into a translucent state. We are familiar with that phenomenon. That's a tipping phenomenon. It's a nonlinear system at work, that it doesn't smoothly run down. It has abrupt changes. And that's what the question is about. Climate science has made that into a major thing. And the answer to your question, sir, was when I was discussing your question about prices versus quantities, and I talked about a precipice, I had in mind a tipping point. If you face a tipping point in the sense that, and you don't quite know how bad it's going to be, because we haven't been there, remember, in millions of years, let's say 3 degrees, 4 degrees above pre-industrial level. That's the climate scientists will tell you how many billion years, a million years, we haven't seen that, or we haven't any record of it. Even if we had record of it, we wouldn't really be able to figure out how it's going to affect us, because our entire capital structure of our assets are so different from what was happening then. The world was very different then. So we are looking at tipping points. Okay, tipping points are telling us that we could enter into a regime we have no experience with, or very little experience. So it's not just uncertainty, the future is ambiguous. There's no clarity in our uncertainty even, because we have not experienced it. So you do the best you can, obviously, and see how far you can clear. But it's an argument for using quantity restrictions, to come back to your point, because it's like coming to a precipice and you don't know how deep the precipice is. It's all cloudy. It could be 1 foot. If you fall, it'll be just a foot drop. Could be 10 feet. Could be 1,000 feet. You don't know. You have no experience. Now, what would you do in the situation? Do you say, well, I'll put my money on it being only 1 foot, so I can just skip over and then? Or would you be very worried about stepping over it? That's the kind of thing that tells us that maybe we do need to have quantity restrictions for preventing us from plunging into the precipice. That's what nonlinearity does. You can't sample and say, well, let's try 1 more unit and see what happens, and 1 more unit, and 1 more unit. And suddenly you find that you're in the precipice. But you don't know where the precipice is, by the way. That's another problem. You don't know if it's 1.5, 1.6, 1.7 or something. So obviously it's very sensible to be a bit economical in terms of being cautious, choosing a lower level rather than upper level. That's what tipping points are about. It's an argument for moving away from the price system. Yeah.
This certainly leaves us with a lot of food for thought.
That lady has a question.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm awfully sorry.
Could we have a quick one?
Sorry, I'm time constricted here. You're a biologist. Since you're a biologist.
Thank you, Mr. Professor. I'm Sara Lilja, and I have worked with climate change adaptation in our Ministry of Forestry and Agriculture, and in our Finnish Meteorological Institute with climate issues. And I am pretty worried about the understanding this big issue. For example, tipping points are so difficult issues, and thus I would like to ask you why we don't speak more about the health issues, because health and cultural issues. You spoke about the soil, how important is the productivity of the soil, and you mentioned your mother and the importance of communities, how the local players act. But I think that there's a big problem that the questions are so huge that the global business and global economical processes are so far from the soil productivity and the local questions. And thus I think that the point where we start to speak more about our health issues and the importance about the biodiversity, which is related to our food and to our families. It's so important that might help humankind to understand this critical point where we are. What would you say how to develop our economy so that we, on the same time, take care of the global issues like seas and tropical forests, and on the same time support local producers to have enough energy to produce food and develop sustainable forestry, for example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I can be quite brief because you're quite right. But it's fortunately it's happening. That is to say, the finance minister should be cognizant of the fact that there are health benefits, mental health benefits, quite apart from other benefits, of having green space, especially in a very urbanized center like England is. Okay, there is now quite a bit of work on this, and the mental health savings, which of course any good finance minister how much money are we going to save if we can do this, right? So the cost benefit analysis that the governor was asking, one of the benefits would be would be measured in terms of the foregone expenditure for mental health, for example. There is a good deal of work on this, and I'm not an expert on it, but I've tried to summarize somewhat what we know in the review. I'm talking only of mental health, but of course there's physical health too, being able to go for walks and so forth. I remember England is an extremely obese country, as you probably know. They need to walk a lot more than they do. So, but where do they walk? They need some green space, rather clean. So they shouldn't be breathing fumes only. So yes, the health part is beginning to be understood and is being incorporated in some parts of the world, certainly. In New Zealand, when I was there, they were very, very keen on that aspect of it. The productivity increases due to the saving of finances. Yeah. Thank you very much for asking.
Thank you very much, Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta. It's been an honor, pleasure, and privilege.
Thank you very much.
And now I would like to invite Finance Minister Annika Saarikko to give the closing remarks of the conference.
Thank you, Niklas, and ladies and gentlemen. What an interesting time we have spent together. Thank you, Mr. Professor. and the fruitful discussion and good questions which you had. As I'm convinced that this event, it has provided new ideas and valuable food for thought for all of us. I foresee the ecological sustainability as a key challenge for the economic policy, not only for today, but for the coming decades. We are now facing the truth. We have to act. The Dasgupta review and also the speech here, it will serve as an initial map on the road where a lot of more specific guidance and concrete actions will be needed. I hope that Finland will among global pioneers in finding the path forward. And with these words, as a closing remarks, I would like to thank you. And thanks for organizing this interesting seminar. Thanks for coming. And I hope you have some time to stay here and a chance to stay for a while here with us here in Finland and enjoy this beautiful nature which we are having and the beautiful nature which we take better care of. Thank you and have a nice day for everybody.